Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live webinar. We are based in Bangkok, so would like to say good afternoon from here, and maybe good morning or good evening from wherever you are. We hope you all are safe and take care of yourselves. Today, the topic of the webinar is International Visitor Arrivals into Asia Pacific in 2020 and expectations for 2021. And the speaker for today is John Kodowski. He is a special advisor to the CEO of PATA and a professor and foreign expert in School of Tourism at Lechan Normal University in China. So before we start, I would like to note on a few things. As usual, we will have Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar in the Q&A function below. Please don't use the chat function to submit your questions because it will be difficult for us to separate for the session later. Also, many has already asked about the presentation. So I would just want to let you know that the presentation and the webinar recording will be made available next week. And we will send an email to all participants who have registered with the link to download of the presentations. The webinar recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. You can search PATA TV on YouTube and feel free to subscribe to watch our recordings at your convenience. So now, without further ado, I would like to pass this to PATA CEO, Ms. Dr. Mario Hardy. So over to you now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And also let me introduce the young lady sitting next to me, who's actually Kun Per. She works in our research department, and she's the one who emceed this session today. As I said, very good afternoon to everyone. Great pleasure to be here with you today. I don't know how you feel, but it feels like we've just been sitting together a few weeks ago, although it was several months ago, looking at the forecast, looking at scenarios for 2020 and 2021 onward. And who would have thought that almost 9 months later we'd be sitting in practically the same position as we were. This crisis has affected the tourism sector immensely throughout the world. Every country, every destinations have been severely impacted. Millions and millions of jobs impacted. Many businesses have closed. And it is a really, really challenging position to be in at the moment. We have heard news of vaccines earlier in the week, which is a good news, but that is likely not to be the only solution moving forward. We will have to live with the current pandemic with COVID-19, most likely for years to come. So let's have a look today with Professor Kodowski in terms of, I wouldn't necessarily call them forecasts. I would more prefer to call them as scenarios or potential scenarios for the month and years to come as to what we actually seeing based on the early numbers that we've seen for 2020, which, as you can expect, are extremely low. So I look forward to hear from John, and we'll come back later on for Q&A and for some discussions. Thanks to all of you who have already sent many questions. We have over 300 participants joining us today, and we've already received over nearly 50 questions to be answered, and I'm sure you will continue and send others during the presentation from Professor Kodowski. So, John, over to you. Thank you.
Mario, I agree entirely that we're past the forecasting stage. We're definitely looking more into what scenarios are likely to play out over the coming months. So I certainly agree that a scenario is a better choice of words. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at where we are now, how we got here, and then what the latest forecast, get rid of that, what the latest scenarios are suggesting might be a way forward. The agenda is pretty simple. We'll have a look at the global position, international tourism, where we got to in 2019 and where we are today. We'll have a look at the world economy, how that's faring today. Then we'll hone into Asia Pacific, looking specifically at the pathway to international tourism 2019, how we got there and where we are now, and then early estimates of some potential scenarios for the next few years. You'll note that the scenarios are now going out just 3 years, simply because once you go beyond that, it starts to become a real guessing game. As you're all aware, things are changing on a daily basis. So to try and project out 5 years doesn't really work all that well. So even 2021, 22 and 23, you'll see that they are updated not once a year now, but they will be updated at least twice a year because things are changing so dramatically. We need to also consider what these scenarios look like relative to the SDGs. And there's no question about it. The state of the earth, the state of our biosphere is severely impacting health and security measures, and that is dramatically affecting the lives of all of us, and especially travel and tourism around the world. And then a very quick couple of slides about some impacting factors that we have to be aware of in terms of what they might mean for these projections. So, global ITAs, international tourist arrivals. That's a UNWTO definition, someone who spends more than 24 hours in a destination. And I think really the latest World Tourism Barometer from the UNWTO sums up very nicely when they say that international travel plunges 70% in the first 8 months of 2020. And a lot of emphasis on that plunges. This is not a minor downturn. This is severe. And in fact, you can see that in terms of Asia and the Pacific, we're performing a little worse than the global situation. Africa, etc., not quite as bad, but all negative and all strongly negative. So the global position from a tourist arrival point of view is, as you know, you're feeling it, fairly dramatic. In Africa, North Africa is down, Sub-Sahara Africa is down. I mean, you go through all the sub-regions of the Americas, of Africa, of Asia, and they're all below the line. And whether it's 86.3%, negative 86.3%, it doesn't really matter. It's down by one heck of a lot. And that's constant right across all of the regions of the world, as you can see. The impact of all of this is that we can expect around about 700 million fewer international tourist arrivals in 2020 year to date relative to January, August. But it's going to also have an impact of about $730 billion in export revenues. And as you know, a loss of over 100 million tourism-related jobs. And in fact, if we look at where those jobs are lost from the WTTC, they're saying that Asia has lost a significant proportion. Almost 2/3 of that loss is right here. The Americas, Europe and Africa still suffering, but not as severely as Asia has right now. And all of that, of course, will affect the travel and tourism GDP losses as well, which again are substantive. The UNWTO expert panel, routinely give their inputs into what they believe are likely to happen in the next few months and what they evaluated the last few months by. And you can see it fell off a cliff quite clearly. And you can see where that happened before in 2008, 2009. The uptick is saying, well, we expect that maybe the worst of that is over and we're starting to move forward, but it's still one heck of a long way down before it gets back to any level of parity with 2019. And keep that in mind because you'll see later that we are talking years, not months. In fact, according to the UNWTO, the panel generally believes that any rebound is likely to be in the second quarter of next year with a stronger rebound or more believing that rebound is in the third quarter of last year. And some are even saying fourth quarter and others even further out, 2022. So it's still very much anybody's guess at this stage, but the consensus view is that we should start to see some movement by the third quarter of next year. At least that's what the majority of the respondents believe. As we said, the expectations are for 70% decrease, some rebound by second quarter 21 and third quarter 21, but a return to pre-pandemic 2019 levels is not likely before 2023. And here the question has to be asked, do we really want to get back to that level of global arrivals, or is there a better way? What are we really trying to measure here? What are we really trying to do with travel and tourism? We could certainly use this time to rethink exactly what we want. It's not more. The days of unlimited growth are rapidly drawing to an end. And again, the UNWTO is suggesting that there are three pathways, if you like, or three scenarios through this morass, none of them getting above that line in this year. And in fact, with the third scenario, with a loss of 78%, that's tracking down low for quite some time. A key point about these scenarios is that they're always made on the best information that is available at the time of producing those scenarios. But as new information comes to light, they need to be fed into these models, and they could, in fact, dramatically alter the pathway of some of these scenario progressions. And that's why if you look at that solid blue line, which is the actual data, followed by the dotted line, which are estimates for July and August, it's essential that this information continues to be fed into these systems so that we can see how it's affecting the trend lines of these scenarios. So everything is based on data. The more data we can get, the quicker we can get it, and we can plug it into these models, the better to make an estimate going forward. But it is all dependent and contingent upon having reliable, useful, and rapid data. Now, all of these impacts on travel and tourism have also flowed across into the world economy. And The IMF last month released their October update for the World Economic Outlook. And if you look at the second tagline, a long and difficult ascent, that really says everything, because it will turn around, it will start to climb back up, but it's going to be very, very difficult and arduous, not just on travel and tourism, but on all concerned. And we can see that if we look at their updated output figures, the annual change in real GDP, you can see that they're expecting a drop of about 4.4% this year. This is a little better than their original forecast in April, but it's still well below the line. But then an expectation for about 5.2% growth in 2021, and then about 3.5% in 2022. And more importantly, it's affecting both the advanced economies and the emerging and developing economies, of which Asia, most of Asia fits into that second category, in roughly the same pathways, but at different levels of intensity. The good news being that it looks like it will get above the line in 2021. But herein lies a trap, because it doesn't take a whole lot of growth after you've had a very negative year like we are having now to get back above the line. So if you compare that 5.2% expectation against where it was in 2019, it's really only adding about 0.6% to the actual overall volume. So whenever you look at percentages, again, always look at the base volumes, because they can tell you a slightly different story. In terms of their projections, you can see for 2020, most are in the negative. And here I reversed it. So those in the black are actually negative, and the one in red, China, is actually likely to get through 2020 with some sort of growth, and then stronger growth in 2021. So while the impact is right across the globe, it's a little bit uneven, and you'll see in other slides coming up how that plays out in different metrics. The good news is that McKinsey and Company, they run a series of surveys where they ask executives around the world, what do they think is going on? What is your sentiment about the position to date? In the latest survey for October, you can see that the better grouping, if you like, is starting to grow. It's not as strong as it was in September. So there was a slight hiccup down in October 2020, but nevertheless, those that believe economic conditions over the next 6 months will improve are way above what they were in March, April, and even May. So the economic sentiment, if you like, is slowly getting a little better. About 19% think it's going to stay the same, but again, more importantly, 29% believe it's going to get worse, and that has been steadily decreasing. So there's a certain sense of bullishness out there, but only in terms of it's going to get better. It will not get back rapidly to what it was in 2019. That needs to be made very, very clear. Significantly, those regions and countries that believe it's going to be better in 6 months, Greater China leads the pack, then India, then Asia Pacific, and you can see that North America is there as well. In Europe, it's sort of trending down the other way. They're starting to sort of feel a little bit gloomier. So once again, even though there is this gradually growing sense of things will get better, it is not by any stretch of the imagination uniform across the globe. But what we want to talk about is the international visitor arrivals. This is the PATA version. PATA looks at visitor arrivals because we are more interested in the economic and socio-economic impact of travellers when they cross international borders or borders of any sort. And so day travellers from southern China into Hong Kong, or southern China into Macau, from Hong Kong into Macau and so forth, all have a significant stimulatory impact, albeit not in a traditional way. And here you can see that this is where we were in 2019. It was a nice steady progression upwards, and then clunk, a drop of about 83% in 2020, as we estimate now, based on the latest data to date. Into the Americas, similar. And again, here, even though we've got point numbers there up to 2019, which are actuals, when we get to 2020 estimates and beyond into the forecasts, really what we want you to do is to look at the trend. The actual numbers themselves, there'll be variation in that, obviously, but we're looking at which way is it going and how quickly is it going in that direction. So really think about the trend of this sort of growth. And I go way, way, way back when I first started forecasting in the telecommunications sector. And I remember one of the mantras there was that the trend is your friend. Well, we're in a situation now where there's not a whole lot of good trend data to actually play with. So have a look at the way it's heading in the Americas, in Asia, 86, 87% down. The Northeast Asia, stronger drop. Into South Asia, a drop. And those numbers are really falling to very, very low levels into West Asia. West Asia, there is only one destination, that's Turkey, for which we have enough data going back over a long enough time period to be able to make these sort of estimates. And you can see that it's suffering again. The Pacific, of course, 13 destinations there. Melanesia, Micronesia, Oceania, and Polynesia. So that's where we're getting to right now and where we expect to be by the end of 2020. From that, we've projected out as to what are some likely scenarios for the next few years. And we're looking at 39 destinations in Asia Pacific, because not every destination has data up to 2020. Some are even lagging by a year or more. We've got 39 of the strongest destinations with enough data to allow the models to work with some accuracy. And it should be understood that these 39 together represent about 95% of the destinations in Asia Pacific for which we have, for which PATA normally produces data on. Doesn't cover everyone in West Asia, does not cover everyone in Central Americas and South America, simply because of a lack of data. If we had the data, we would include it. But here's what we're looking at. In the worst case scenario, 2021 is going to be a further downturn from even what we're experiencing this year. But the most likely scenario will still be down, and in the best case, we might see a little bit of growth. But it's really not until 2022 that we start to see that curvature begin to move upwards a little more strongly. And even here, under the the best case scenario, 2023 is unlikely to get back to where the 2019 level was, 703.387 million. So there is movement. There is an expectation in each of these scenarios that we've still got some bottoming out to do, but it's going to shift and move slowly upwards. In the Americas, you can see, again, it's a similar sort of trend going from the worst case scenario, which is obviously slower, and to the best case. I point out also that the most likely, or the mid scenario, is not the midpoint between the high and the low. It's a separate scenario. It's a separate set of circumstances, of expectations, of assumptions, and so forth. It's not always just the midpoint. And into Asia, at the best case, it could be getting close to where we were in 2019, but that's not for a couple of years. And again, the question we really need to consider is, do we really want to focus on numbers of people? Are there better metrics that we should be looking at? Now's the time that we can rebuild the travel and tourism reporting mechanism to give us some valuable, really valuable data, not just a head count. And Northeast Asia, you'll see. South Asia. Southeast Asia, best case scenario will be 2023 will get back over the 2019 peak. Under these scenarios, under the assumptions that have been worked into these scenarios at this point in time. And Turkey, as you can see. In the Pacific, again, 2023 is likely, under the best case scenario, to be above 2019, but in the worst case scenario, it's still going to be half. So there's a fair range in there, but the expectation as the most likely is about 22 million. Melanesia, they're all following that same sort of bottom out and then pick up and move forward. Oceania, which of course is just Australia and New Zealand, and Polynesia. So the good news is that there is expected to be some upward movement. The bad news is that it may not happen as rapidly as some of us would like, and we still have a little bit of pain to go through based on numbers like this before we can expect any sort of turnaround. But that's the destinations. We need also to consider this in terms of, well, if you're saying we can expect some sort of movement, some sort of positive growth, where is it coming from? And that's a useful, obviously, a useful question to ask. And the way we've done this is looking just at the median scenario, okay? For 19, 20, 21, and 22, 19 being actual. Instead of looking at the numbers, we look at the mix. What is the proportion of arrivals from Asia into Asia Pacific in 2019? And that was 64.4%. By 2020, that's going to drop away quite substantially to 44% this year, obviously. Borders are still shut and the like. But a slow return in 2021, and as you can see, by 2022, it's starting to get close to back where it was. And this is the medium scenario. Under the lower case scenario, of course, that return is a lot slower, but under the best case scenario, it will be a little quicker. I'm just trying to give you a feel for how we're looking at what might be playing out in these scenarios. And one of the reasons to look at it in terms of share came out of the Maldives when we were looking at, well, okay, the Maldives have opened up again in July and August, and they actually had some arrivals, well down on what they were previously. But you know what's going on here? And what we found is for the month of August only, what we found was that in terms of the mix, there was a slight increase in Russians, a slight increase in the United Kingdom, but wow, the UAE really sort of powered along. This raised the spectre that when things start to come back, it might not come back to what it was. The overall mix might be very different. The corridors between the origin, the destination, the corridors, the bubbles, call them what you will, but they may change and you may see a slightly different clientele. Now, this is only 1 month. We're waiting to see if this is a trend or if this is simply a one-off, but it does raise that interesting point. And you can see how that plays out in the case of the mix in the Americas, where in 2020, the Americas, a little bit down, but then dropping dramatically in 2021. Out of Asia, dramatic decrease for the next 12 months plus. Same out of Europe, down by half, but picking up again in 2022. In Asia, dramatic drop in relative share out of Asia into Asia, but an increase in relative terms, not in numeric terms, in relative terms, out of Europe before falling back to what it once was. So there's all sorts of movement up and down depending upon the source market. And in the Pacific, we can see that whereas Asia was the dominant source market, slightly ahead of the Americas, that's going to shift this year with the Americas dominating, and that will hold out until 2022 before it reverts back to what we think it is likely to be, back with Asia as the dominant supplier. Now, these are all numbers, but they're predicated on a whole host of other factors. And one of the lead indicators that we like to use is looking at air capacity and how that is deployed at various ports around Asia Pacific and in fact across the globe. And the source of this is OAG data. They very kindly work with PATA and provide a lot of this information through the PATA mPower data platform. And if we look at inbound flights, you can see, surprise, surprise, it's a similar sort of trajectory, trend, if you will, to what we're seeing or expecting with the scenarios. And that is that we were growing quite nicely and then all of a sudden fell off a cliff, and now it's a long, hard growth back up to some level of capacity. This is by quarter and year, and it's only to third quarter 2021. But what we're looking at is the trend, okay? And if we look at that in terms of seats, obviously it's a similar type of trend pattern. The LCC flights are very important to Asia Pacific, particularly because they move a lot of people from Asia to Asia, from the Americas to the Americas, and from the Pacific to the Pacific and the like. And you can see that with a few more hiccups along the way, it's following a roughly similar trend line, and same with the seats. So this gives us validation, if you like, that at least the direction and the strength that we see with the visitor scenarios is actually holding up pretty well based on where these airlines are deploying their aircraft. Bear in mind, however, that these are schedules that they put out ahead of time. They may not eventuate as such. Okay? Things may happen in the meantime. But for right now, for this moment, it gives us an indication that everyone seems to be thinking in roughly the same way. And you can see of the global inbound flights and seats that the proportion into Asia Pacific, there's a definite seasonality pattern there. They follow similar pathways. Same with the LCCs. Now, what can go wrong? Well, should I say what else can go wrong? Well, there's quite a lot. The main components, again, this is from the UNWTO, that respondents believe are limiting the recovery of at least international tourism. Travel restrictions, big one. A slow or slower than expected virus containment. Low consumer confidence, it's still only under 50%, but that's a big one. Consumer confidence, that's going to take up a lot of marketing expertise and time trying to rebuild that in the consumer base. The economic environment is, of course, a lack of coordinated response among countries. Absolutely. It's no good flying from a point of origin to a destination if when you arrive, you have to be quarantined in a hotel for 2 weeks, especially if you're only there for 7 days. So what are you going to do? You're going to avoid it. So there needs to be coordination that if a corridor is opening up or a bubble is opening up, then there are reciprocal arrangements at each end, allowing people to move around. There's also a real constraint in as much as, is this current COVID-19 virus, is it going to, or has it so far mutated? They've found a mutated virus in minks in Denmark, and so they're culling 15 million minks as a form of protection. The reality is, I believe, the latest that I've read on it anyway, is that the virus has mutated countless times already, but thankfully for us, not in a form that is more pathogenic and more transferable. But with minks, they're not taking any chances, so 15 million of them are going to be slaughtered. There is good news on the inoculation front. In recent days, in fact, there's been significant advancements in the phase 3 trials for immune responses and the like, with at least 2, if not more, companies saying that it appears they have something that is viable and that works in around 90% of cases. There are still issues with producing enough, with transporting enough, and with storing enough. In one case, it has to be stored at a very, very cold -70 or something environment. And outside of major cities, not too many places have that sort of storage facility. Another company says that theirs is not that sensitive to heat, and therefore it's more stable at lower at temperatures that don't need to be -70 or below. It's all depending upon who can produce it, who can produce quantities of it, how successful is it in reality, excuse me, and then who gets it first. That's a political debate all on its own. who should be the first ones to get it. There's a leaning towards those in the front line of treatment at hospitals and clinics should obviously be the first to get it. So this is not an easy story either, but at least we're in a better position in terms of the availability of inoculants than we were 6 months ago. Other considerations we need to take in our thinking: unemployment rates. Has anyone really thought about what the impact of unemployment is going to be on your source markets as well as your destination markets? A lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people have lost their businesses, their houses, their savings. Unlikely they're going to be traveling anytime in the near future. And look at what I mean by this. If we talk about Europeans, and this top 10 here is equivalent to more than 80% of the arrivals generated from Europe into Asia Pacific last year. And in the majority of these cases, you look how they're actually increasing quite dramatically. Spain going from 14% to 17% and staying there. Sweden, even Sweden going from 6.8 to 9.3 by 2021. This is going to weigh heavily on many politicians around the world for obvious reasons. The Americas, I mean, you imagine the poor people of Venezuela when the unemployment rate in this or last year was 47.6, and it's going to jump to over half. But over half of your resident population are without work. How do you handle that? What will the politics of that unemployment mean for those countries, and then ultimately for potential travellers from those? It's still significant across Asia as well, not as much as in other parts, but it's still very high in certain parts, as you can see from these. And in the Pacific, it's jumping as well. I don't know why I forgot to mark those in red. I apologise. Now, the developments of this. So, a group of analysts at Deutsche Bank have put forward the idea of a work from home tax, because they're saying that, wow, you know, they're still benefiting from employment, and governments need to actually get some revenue to be able to do certain things, particularly in the health and safety area. So why don't we hit them with a 5% privilege tax? So, you know, a privilege tax for working from home. I have to smile when I see that, you know, these analysts, Deutsche Bank was the same bank that was recently fined $150 million for its dealing with Jeffrey Epstein anyway. But what it points out is that already there is some thinking going about, where do we get some money from? How do we generate revenue? And that's got both positive and negative ramifications. This is a follow-on from that, when you notice that the proportion of Americans working from home before the pandemic was 5.4%, and during the pandemic it jumped to 56%. So, yeah, another 5% tax on top of everything else. I'm not sure that's going to go down terribly well with the voting public, but we'll see how that plays out and whether or not it gains any traction. The reality is that we need to understand, what are we going to do? You know, things will get better, but it looks like it's going to take some time. So what do we need to do? What can we do to actually emerge from this, having learnt a few lessons and being in a better position to face the next one? Allied to that is the question that, in that context, are the Sustainable Development Goals, are they likely to be achieved? How important are they really? And where do they fit in these scenarios? Well, again, we have a realistic situation where it's a balancing act, and we need to balance the stakeholders, looking after the stakeholders with looking after the shareholders. It's not a one or. It's both need to be looked at in this context. Many international organizations are saying we need to rebuild with a greener focus. And everyone's talking about it, and most people agree. But very few seem to know what exactly is that going to entail. How do we do that? How do we do that without jeopardizing our current way of life and so forth? Well, the reality there is that we will have to adjust our way of life. The new normal, I dislike that term because there is no such thing as a new normal. There is a constant series of upheavals coming our way, and we simply have to react to them as best we can or avoid them wherever possible. But in the majority of cases, we cannot avoid them. But in trying to actually deal with all of these components, one very interesting, very short report by Boston Consulting Group, worth a read. They give 8 suggestions, and I'm not looking at them all, I'm just looking at a few. The first one is make remote work work. It's here to stay. And some organizations like Google and the like have already said that, yep, we're going to continue with this. Now, the flow-on effect of that is that if you're managing office rental space in big cities and the like, that might not be such great news for you. But it also suggests that in particular, those people who work in the tertiary sector, in the knowledge economy, they can be anywhere, provided they have good digital connection and good physical connection back to a central location. The thing is that it's here to stay. It's an option. We need to make it work. But we need also to understand how to work from home. What we're seeing, if you believe a lot of the material that's appearing in the media and in the academic articles and journals, is that a lot of people working from home are actually working longer, getting stressed out more. They're having trouble differentiating between work time and non-work time, and that's creating a whole raft of psychological problems that will need handling down the line. To my mind, this is one of the most important. Seek out fresh signals. All the data, all the signals that we used in the past to indicate what might be happening or what might be coming needs to be revamped. It needs to be improved, it needs to be accelerated, and it needs to be delivered to people who can use it. I scratch my head sometimes when I hear about the advances in technology and how we can now go through, swipe your passports and you're in a destination, etc. Why then does it take 6, 9, 12 months for that data to come through to the industry? We should, at this stage, be getting, as we did in 2008 and SARS and the like, whatever that was, the economic crisis, getting dailies. Just give us a numbers count every day, how many in, how many out, etc., and work backwards from that. The data that's inherent in everyone's passport, you can tell us the port of entry, the date, the time of entry, the nationality of the passport holder, and a couple of other things like gender and age and so forth. You can also, from the swipe in, swipe out statistics, tell us how long they were in destination. So all of a sudden, it's no longer this many Australians, this many Germans, whatever. It's this many Australians who stayed so many cumulative nights in country, etc., etc. That helps the industry to target those individuals that have a higher potential for conversion into touring, into shopping, into dining, into accommodation. Someone who spends 3 nights in destination versus someone who spends 7 nights in destination, well, you work the math out. We have the data, it goes somewhere, but it doesn't get back to the travel and tourism industry. Sometimes not at all, but in other times, very, very late, with at least 6 months lag time. Not enough. That's got to be quicker. Talk to your consumers in a different way. They maintain that using AI-based machine learning could help you do a number of things, including building customer trust. That is going to be a key issue going forward. And I saw this wonderful quote about AI, and it comes from Artie, appeared in MIT's Sloan Management Review. And he makes the point that for us, AI doesn't mean artificial intelligence. We talk about amplified intelligence. In other words, the human and the machine working together, 1 + 1 equals more than 2. An interesting approach, mindset shift. We need to do a lot of that. Think about more than money. It's people, right? What people have lost, and start to think about articulating a purpose beyond profit so that you can have a positive impact on society. It's going to be tough. It will improve, but you have to hang in there. Never, ever give up. Just like this frog. Do that, and eventually one day we can all be smiling through and remembering back to the bad old days. Xie, thank you from China. Back to you, I should say. Orani Cha and Mario.
Thank you, John. We've let you carry on for quite a while because actually you've answered a lot of the questions that were actually sent before, but we have over 50 questions that actually came in during your speech, and also that we had before in total. So we're going to go through a couple of them. I know we're supposed to be ending this in about 5 minutes, and if it's okay with all of the audience, we'll probably carry on for another 10, just to make sure that we answer a few of the key questions that were sent before. So apologies in advance if some of your questions are not answered.
I apologize, Mario, but you know me, when I get excited into the story, I've got to take it through to its conclusion.
That's okay, John. It was interesting. I do have one question that I want to ask, which is you've talked about the different scenarios at the beginning, the 3 different scenarios, from the lower end to high end in terms of impact. And so the question is about what are the criteria that went into making these scenarios? What are the difference between each the 3 of them?
Good question. Is Haiyan there in the audience? Because I think he would be a better person to actually take you through some of that. Professor Song, are you there?
He may be, but I'm not sure he has the ability to speak, John.
Okay. Well, there are certain things like, for example, will the air corridors reopen? Will the airports actually begin to allocate slots again to various airlines? Will airlines who are currently in a state of no flight, will they get back off the ground? What will happen with TG, for example? Will that be restructured? Can it become profitable? Can it come back into the system? If those things work, then we can look towards an upper scenario. If they take longer to happen, then that will reduce the timing. So those sorts of things. When will the vaccine be available for the majority of the population? Does the vaccine work? Will there be a second spike through the November winter? Will there be something else? All of these things come into play, and we can say that, now let's assume that no, there won't be a second spike. No, there won't be a mutation. no, there won't be something else, then we can expect to see consumer confidence increase. That will move into the upper levels of the scenario. If, however, they all collapse, then obviously we're going back into the to the negative area. So it's all a question of what's the possibility of this occurring, and then what's the probability of that occurring, and those two help drive the position in each case.
Good, thank you, John. There's a question here from Jody from Hong Kong. Do you think companies will remain conservative about business travel over the long term? You've talked a lot about working from home and how actually the working from home policies have increased enormously during this period of time. Do you think this will have a long-term impact on business travel?
My personal view is that will have a longer term impact than leisure travel, yes. And that has incredible implications for the airlines who look at the front end of the aircraft to subsidize the economy travel. So yeah, there's all sorts of flow on and ebbs and flows within this, but short answer is yes. I believe that people have now found there are there are different ways to actually conduct business meetings. And I think that they will accelerate, and that will affect the travel.
Thank you, John. Here's another question from Tourism Malaysia. What's PATA uptake on the reluctance of most countries to open borders for tourism? I'm happy to answer that question. I can sympathize with many of the countries who had their border closed here in Asia during that period of time. I mean, if you look at the comparison with other destinations around the world, in North America and Europe, where the pandemic is, the number of cases per day are by the thousands, if not the tens of thousands, even more in some cases, where in most countries around Asia, it's in the dozens, in some cases, almost zero in most instances. So it actually does make you think the balance between safety of your residents and the need for the economy also to reopen. And the challenge is to really to achieve that balance between the two. Our position here at PATA has been that we do want countries to reopen their borders, but to reopen them safely, to have the proper safety protocols in place. We also under the belief that quarantines are not necessary, unless obviously that someone tested positive, then yes, they do have to quarantine. What we'd like to see is testing before departure, testing at arrival, and the same when you go home and on the return, having the tracing in place, having the common pass, the digital health passport, to know that the testing that was done, when it was done, who's done it, it was legitimate. And also when you have the vaccine, to have the ability to track both who's been vaccinated and when and by who, as well as those who've been tested. Because what we have to remember, as John mentioned, the vaccines will take years for the entire population, global populations, to be vaccinated. We will have to coexist with COVID for an extensive period of time. We want borders to reopen. They need to reopen for saving this industry and many other industries that have been impacted by the current situation. But it has to be done in a safe manner. And so we see the process of having these protocols, and one of the important words is common protocols that are actually harmonized between either regions or even preferably on a global basis, to make it as easy, as simple as possible for to travel safely, and for people who are selling the trips to know exactly what people are supposed to do when they travel to their destinations. So I think that's the key point that we need to look at. There was another question, John, here from our dear friend Nancy from Switzerland. Are destinations in Asia Pacific making an effort to rethink tourism and ensure sustainable growth in the future?
There's a lot of talk about it, but as you know, talk is cheap. I've yet to see any substantive efforts being made at this point. Not to say they won't be made, but at the moment, it's a case of everyone saying, yes, we need to do that. But the urgency to get back into the old mode of things where we have revenue coming in, we've got people employed. Again, it's that balancing act. My biggest fear, the elephant in the room, if you will, is that the precedent has been set so that borders can be shut very quickly. So if there is a re-emergence, expect it to be shut again. If there is another pandemic, a different virus, that can happen again. So we're liable to, as you say, have to live with this for quite some time.
Thank you, John. A question from Sanjeet from India. What will the future visitors be looking for in their new travels in terms of culture, adventure, sun and sea, or more eco-travel destinations in the future?
Well, the first thing they're going to be looking for is to be kept safe and healthy, number one. The second area that is that we're interested in and we're looking at is a continuation of cultural tourism, where it's becoming sort of, how can I put it? It's becoming more involved with local communities at a very much smaller scale. So it's developing a very different experience, if you will. The problem with that is that we have to now turn around and say, well, will a local community accept visitors from outside, given that there could be, in their minds, some risk of infection? So we've still got a long way to go, but the trend is there that we're moving from cultural tourism into creative tourism.
Thank you, John. There's a question here from James, which I think is important to address. He's referring to mental health and the fact that we have so millions of people who have lost their jobs during this time. And as you've shown in your charts before, the unemployment rate in various countries around the world is mind-boggling, the numbers you shared before. So this naturally has an impact on people's well-being, mental being also. And what are the opportunities for them to learn new skills during that time, to be able to work either in other sectors or to strengthen their skills to rejoin the industry when borders start to reopen. And there are many actually services already available. Many of the large organizations such as Udemy, Coursera, Harvard, and others have opened up their platforms, their online platform for people to take up new skills for free or at very little cost, but in most cases actually free. Here at PATA, we've launched 2 months ago an e-learning platform. If you go to the PATA website, there's dozens of destinations that you can actually get certification to learn about the destination, the product available in the various places, and etc. And there's a lot also available on the PATA YouTube channels of the hundreds of plus of webinars that we've organized since the beginning of the year. Some are educational, and you can actually take up some skills from there. You can also visit the PATA CRC or crc.pata.org, which is our crisis resource center, where we have toolkits and also some educational information available for people to gain some new skills during that time. And I believe we have probably enough time for another 1 or 2 questions. And there's one from Roger Carter. What assumptions are being made about consumer confidence and the financial ability to travel to and within the Asia Pacific for major global markets, and also the availability of airlift moving forward? So 2 questions, like airlift, and one is the capability, financial capability for people to travel.
Some of those we can quantify. Airlift, we can begin to quantify. The unknowns are how quickly it will take for consumer confidence to return, and also for the ability of people and the desire for people to want to travel, particularly long haul. For the short-term scenarios, we really believe that it's still going to be very much intra-regional. Asia to Asia, Europe to Europe, Americas to Americas, and that's going to drive it. And the other flows will take longer, we believe, to come back, and they could vanish just as quickly. They could just disappear overnight if anything happens. One of the one of the interesting arguments now is, could this spell the end of the hub and spoke system for aviation? Excuse me. In other words, do you want to fly from Heathrow to another airport, go through the risk again, and before you get to your destination, or do you want point to point? All these things are actually being discussed and could result in significant change and challenges.
Thank you, John. One last question for you, and I'll answer another one after, which has been asked many times. Last one for you, John, is to what degree do the future of travel scenarios you shared rely on China as a source market?
I think they all do. I mean, China is a huge player in that respect. But again, it's if it doesn't happen the way it was happening in the past, something else will evolve to actually fill that gap. Take a lot longer, but something or some other markets will evolve and actually eventually fill that gap. A critical concern in that regard is how are Asians going to be treated when they travel to other destinations? And we've heard stories about the backlash in Europe, backlash in the Americas, et cetera, just because you look Asian. That obviously could change things and further enhance the intra-regional flows. But even now, for the moment, China is still a huge player for Asia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. There was a lot of questions during that we received prior to the event regarding bubbles or corridors. And it's a question I have been answering almost on a daily basis through various media interviews. And one of the reasons why we have to stop this session pretty soon is I have to jump into a media interview about travel bubbles. But a lot of questions have been asked about it for a few reasons, because they've been in discussions already for several months. And people are asking, why is it taking so long? Why is there not more travel bubbles or corridors being implemented today? And my answer to this is actually the complexity of setting up these corridors and these bubbles. It's not as simple of questions of two countries agreeing, we're going to accept all your residents and vice versa. There's a lot of people being involved in these discussions from the health department, from ministries of tourism and transport, immigration, customs, and etc. And why is that? You need to have a good handle on the number of cases at both destinations. That's critical. Second is you need to have a good healthcare system in both destinations also. You need to have a common set of protocols that are acceptable, accepted, and recognized by both countries also. What type of testing is being done, when the testing needs to be done, what type of other tracing is required or not required, any quarantine required or not required at both ends of the destinations. And there's so many other questions that needs to be answered before a travel bubble is actually put in place. We are already seeing some, November 22nd, in a few days, we'll see the first really bubble between Singapore and Hong Kong. And we'll share with you information about this and about the session we're holding tomorrow about the Destination Insight series on Singapore, which we'll talk about that in a little bit more details. But this is actually something that has been asked by a lot of people. There are many other destinations that are actually in discussions of putting travel bubbles between their respective destinations. We will see more moving forward. As I mentioned before, having the testing protocols in place is required for us to reopen borders. But we also know from the numbers that actually John shared with us that the recovery will be gradual. It won't reopen at a flick of a switch where the world is reopened. It will be through different corridors or bubbles between destinations on a gradual basis until a point where there's actually a common set of protocols across the region or even the world moving forward before we see mass reopening. So I'm afraid that is the only time we have left to cover all the questions. I thank everybody who joined today. I thank John for spending the time with us this afternoon. I'd like to also thank everyone who sent a lot of questions. And again, our sincere apologies for not being able to answer all of them. And thank you for your time today. And I'll pass on the microphone back to Kunper, who would like to share with us some other events happening with PATA tomorrow.
Thank you, John and Mario, for today's webinar. So before we end the session, we would like everyone to join our tomorrow's webinar with Singapore Tourism Board, partner with BBC News. This session called the Destination Insight series on Singapore. So this is the next episode that we did.
Yes, we started a few months ago a series of destination insights with our partner BBC, BBC News, and we do every few weeks or at least once a month. And the next one tomorrow is about Singapore, and I'm sure there will be many questions regarding the corridor reopening between Singapore and Hong Kong, and to understand better what are the protocols being in place, how it's happening, and of course, all of us around the region are watching this corridor and reopening with anticipation and with hope that everything goes really smoothly and it becomes something that could be replicated amongst other destinations around Asia. So if you want to know more about it, please join us tomorrow for this event, and follow us on social media. We have many other activities coming up over the next few weeks. So again, Compare, thank you for being the MC today. John, once again, thank you for joining us. And for all of you, the audience, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you online again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So any questions or for more information, you can go to our website or contact through our email. Thank you. Thank you for joining today. Thank you, John. Bye-bye.